The seeker who turns toward the Hermetic arts confronts an immediate and paradoxical reality. The very act of seeking authentic transformation creates a chasm between oneself and the common world. This is not mere social alienation or the superficial loneliness of modern disconnection. Rather, it represents a fundamental ontological shift in how consciousness relates to collective reality. The alchemist, the Hermetic student, the aspirant to inner nosis. Each discovers that the path of transformation is inherently solitary, not by design of external circumstance, but by the very nature of the work itself. This phenomenon has been recognized throughout the history of esoteric philosophy. When Hermes Trismegistus inscribed the axiom, "As above, so below," upon the emerald tablet, he established a framework wherein the microcosm of individual consciousness must be refined independently before it can truly comprehend or participate in the macrocosm. The Corpus Hermeticum speaks repeatedly of the necessity for the aspirant to withdraw from the multitude, to cultivate silence, and to undergo a process of psychological death and rebirth that cannot be shared with those who remain immersed in the ordinary consciousness of everyday life. Paracelsus understood this isolation as essential to the great work. His writings emphasize that the true laboratory of alchemy exists within the soul of the practitioner, and that external companionship often becomes a hindrance to the ruthless self-examination required for authentic transformation. The medieval alchemists encoded this truth in their imagery: the solitary adept laboring in the athanor, the hermetically sealed vessel wherein base metal transforms into gold through sustained heat and pressure applied in complete isolation from external contamination. Carl Jung, who rescued alchemy from the dustbin of pseudoscience by recognizing it as a psychological cartography of individuation, noted that the process of integrating the shadow and achieving wholeness necessarily creates temporary alienation from collective consciousness. In his analysis of alchemical symbolism, Jung observed that the nigredo, the blackening, the confrontation with psychic putrefaction, represents a phase where the individual must descend alone into the underworld of the unconscious, leaving behind the comfortable illusions maintained by social consensus. The Coagulation, that controversial yet influential Hermetic text, presents 7 principles that govern both cosmic and psychological reality. Each principle, when properly understood and applied, demands a transformation of perception that places the practitioner at odds with consensus reality. To truly grasp that all is mind, or that everything flows, requires abandoning the fixed certainties that bind communities together through shared delusion. Dennis William Hawke, in his comprehensive work, The Emerald Tablet, argues that Hermetic philosophy represents a technology of consciousness that can only be mastered through direct individual experience. No amount of intellectual understanding substitutes for the lived reality of inner transformation, and this transformation cannot be delegated, shared, or conducted collectively. The Hermetic path, Hawke emphasizes, is a path of radical personal responsibility. Eliphas Levi recognized that magical will, the cornerstone of all operative Hermetic work, develops only in solitude and through practices that separate the magician from ordinary social consciousness. Manly Palmer Hall, in his encyclopedic treatment of esoteric traditions, repeatedly returns to the theme that genuine initiation requires a psychological death to one's former identity, a death that leaves the aspirant temporarily unable to communicate their experience to those who have not undergone similar transformation. The fundamental question confronting the modern seeker becomes, why does the pursuit of inner gold necessarily create outer isolation? This is not merely a practical question about lifestyle choices or social consequences. It represents a profound philosophical problem about the relationship between individual transformation and collective existence, between nosis and communion, between the vertical ascent of consciousness and the horizontal bonds of human fellowship. The Hermetic system rests upon a foundation of interconnected principles that, when properly understood, reveal why the alchemical path necessarily separates the practitioner from ordinary consciousness. At the core lies the doctrine of the 3 philosophical principles: sulfur, mercury, and salt. These are not chemical substances, but psychological and spiritual realities that exist within every human being. Sulfur represents the soul, the fiery principle of individual identity and divine aspiration. Mercury embodies the spirit, the fluid principle of consciousness that mediates between matter and divinity. Salt manifests as the body, the principle of crystallization, form, and material existence. The alchemical work demands that the practitioner consciously manipulate these three principles within their own being, a task that immediately creates divergence from those who remain unconscious of these internal dynamics. Most human beings live in an unreflective state, where sulfur, mercury, and salt operate automatically, governed by conditioning, social programming, and biological impulse. The Hermetic aspirant, by contrast, must become conscious architect of these principles, actively separating, purifying, and recombining them according to the patterns revealed in Hermetic texts. This triadic structure finds correlation in numerous esoteric systems. In Kabbalah, the three pillars of the tree of life, severity, mercy, and equilibrium, represent a similar architecture of consciousness. The Neoplatonic tradition speaks of the One, the Nous, and the World Soul as cascading emanations that the individual soul must reascend through philosophical contemplation. Rosicrucian teachings encode the same pattern in their symbolism of the rose, soul, blooming upon the cross, matter, through the intermediary of the dew, spirit. The 7 Hermetic principles, as articulated in the Kybalion, provide a more granular map of the mental laws governing both inner and outer reality. Mentalism establishes that all manifestation originates in mind. Correspondence reveals that patterns repeat across all levels of existence. Vibration demonstrates that nothing rests, all moves, all vibrates at varying frequencies. Polarity shows that opposites are identical in nature, but different in degree. Rhythm indicates that everything flows in cycles of action and reaction. Causation affirms that nothing happens by chance, all proceeds according to law. Gender recognizes that masculine and feminine principles operate throughout all phenomena. Each of these principles, when internalized and applied, transforms the practitioner's relationship to reality in ways that create incompatibility with consensus consciousness. To perceive all external circumstance as ultimately mental, as projection of consciousness rather than independent material fact, places one at odds with the materialist metaphysics that dominate modern culture. To recognize the correspondence between internal psychological states and external life circumstances is to embrace a form of magical causality that scientific materialism dismisses as superstition or delusion. The Hermetic tradition intersects profoundly with psychological depth work, particularly the Jungian project of individuation. Jung recognized that alchemical texts provided a symbolic language for describing the process by which the ego integrates unconscious contents to achieve wholeness. The alchemical marriage of sun and moon, king and queen, corresponds to the integration of conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine principles within the psyche. The production of the philosopher's stone parallels the emergence of the self, that transcendent center of personality that reconciles all opposites. Yet this integration cannot occur while consciousness remains identified with collective values and social personas. Jung observed that the process of individuation necessarily creates conflict between the individual and society because it demands loyalty to inner truth rather than external conformity. The Hermetic aspirant must cultivate what the tradition calls the magical will, a concentrated intentionality that overrides both biological impulse and social conditioning to serve the purposes of the true self. This will cannot develop within the context of normal social existence precisely because social life demands constant compromise, adaptation, and distribution of attention across multiple relationships and obligations. The focused intensity required to consciously direct the 3 philosophical principles, to apply the 7 Hermetic laws, and to navigate the dangerous territories of the unconscious psyche. This intensity burns through the accommodations and half-measures that make communal life possible. The ethics of the Hermetic path differ fundamentally from conventional morality. Rather than obedience to external commandments or conformity to social norms, Hermetic ethics demands radical authenticity and alignment with one's inner truth. This ethical framework, which Aleister Crowley summarized as "do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," does not advocate libertine indulgence, but rather absolute obedience to one's true will, the deepest authentic purpose of one's incarnation. Such obedience inevitably conflicts with social expectations and the agendas others project upon the individual. The Hermetic aspirant must also cultivate a disposition toward doubt, not the corrosive skepticism that denies all possibility of truth, but rather the philosophical doubt that refuses to accept any claim without direct verification through experience. This methodological doubt applies equally to received religious dogma, scientific materialism, and even Hermetic teachings themselves. The aspirant tests all propositions in the laboratory of consciousness, accepting only what proves itself through repeatable inner experience. This insistence on direct nosis rather than faith, on experiential verification rather than authority, immediately separates the Hermetic practitioner from both religious believers, who accept revelation, and secular materialists who accept only external sensory evidence. The Hermetist occupies a third position, accepting the reality of spiritual dimensions, but refusing to believe in them without personal encounter, developing techniques to reproduce mystical states with the same rigor that scientists apply to physical experiments. The interconnection between Hermetic philosophy, depth psychology, and contemplative practice creates a comprehensive system for consciousness transformation. Yet this very comprehensiveness demands total dedication. One cannot be a Hermetic aspirant in one's spare time, any more than one can be partially pregnant. The work requires complete reorganization of one's priorities, values, and daily practices, a reorganization that necessarily creates distance from those who continue to organize their lives around conventional goals of social success, material accumulation, and emotional comfort. The Hermetic path unfolds through a series of definite stages, each representing both an operational procedure and a psychological metamorphosis. These stages cannot be abbreviated, bypassed, or completed intellectually. Each must be lived, suffered through, and embodied before the next stage becomes accessible. This sequential necessity explains much of the loneliness inherent in the work. The aspirant moves through psychological territories that cannot be described to those who have not visited them, creating an experiential gap that makes genuine communication increasingly difficult. The first stage, traditionally called calcination, represents the burning away of ego attachments and false identities. In psychological terms, this corresponds to the systematic identification and conscious experiencing of everything one has repressed, denied, or projected onto others. The aspirant must literally burn in the fire of honest self-perception, allowing the flames of consciousness to reduce pride, vanity, and self-deception to ash. This is not metaphorical discomfort, but actual psychological agony as cherished self-concepts disintegrate under ruthless examination. Jung understood calcination as the initial confrontation with the shadow, those aspects of personality that the ego has rejected and relegated to unconsciousness. The shadow contains not only destructive impulses and shameful desires, but also rejected vitality, creativity, and power that the ego feared to acknowledge. Calcination demands that the aspirant bring all shadow contents into consciousness, experiencing the full spectrum of their psychological reality without defense or rationalization. This stage creates the first profound isolation. Friends and family notice personality changes that seem threatening or inexplicable. The aspirant's emerging authenticity makes others uncomfortable because it implicitly challenges the social game of pretense that maintains group cohesion. Conversations become strained as the practitioner finds themselves unable to participate in collective illusions or to validate the ego identifications of others. The calcinated soul has become too real for comfortable social interaction. Dissolution follows calcination as water follows fire. Having reduced rigid ego structures to ash, the aspirant now experiences the dissolving of all remaining boundaries between conscious and unconscious. This stage corresponds to the flooding of consciousness with material from the personal and collective unconscious. Dreams become vivid and significant. Synchronicities multiply. The clear distinctions between self and other, internal and external, begin to blur in unsettling ways. Psychologically, dissolution represents what Jung called the regression of libido, a withdrawal of psychic energy from external goals and relationships back into the depths of the unconscious. This regression is not pathological but necessary, a strategic retreat that gathers energy for the transformation to come. Yet to others, the practitioner appears to be giving up on life, becoming passive, withdrawn, and overly absorbed in subjective experience. The dissolution stage brings the aspirant face to face with the anima or animus, the contrasexual archetype that mediates between ego and unconscious. For men, the anima appears as the inner feminine, carrying projections of idealized love, mystical longing, and emotional depth. For women, the animus manifests as the inner masculine, representing agency, critical thinking, and spiritual aspiration. Integration of this archetype demands that the aspirant develop the psychological capacities traditionally associated with the opposite sex, a process that may temporarily destabilize gender identity and social relationships. During dissolution, the aspirant often experiences what feels like a loss of sanity. The solid boundaries of normal consciousness dissolve into fluid, dreamlike states, where causality becomes loose and magical thinking seems validated by experience. This is dangerous territory, where many aspirants become trapped in inflation, identifying with archetypal energies beyond their ego's capacity to integrate. The Hermetic tradition insists on maintaining rigorous practice and discipline during this stage precisely to prevent disintegration into actual psychosis. Separation emerges as the third stage, wherein the aspirant learns to discriminate between true and false, essential and accidental, within the dissolved psychic material. This corresponds to the development of what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold opposites in consciousness without identifying with either pole. The aspirant learns to observe psychological content without being swept away by it, to experience powerful emotions without acting them out, to recognize archetypal patterns without confusing them with personal identity. This discriminating awareness allows the practitioner to separate the volatile from the fixed, the mercury from the sulfur, the spirit from the soul. In practical terms, this means learning which impulses serve authentic growth and which merely recreate familiar patterns of suffering. The aspirant develops what might be called inner sobriety, a capacity to remain centered while psychological storms rage through consciousness. The separation stage intensifies isolation because the practitioner can no longer unconsciously participate in the collective emotional field. Where others react automatically to social cues, following scripts of anger, fear, desire, and pride, the separated consciousness observes these patterns without identification. This creates a peculiar quality of presence that others find simultaneously attractive and disturbing. The aspirant seems both deeply engaged and mysteriously detached, present but not quite participating in the usual social dance. Conjunction marks the beginning of reunification under a new principle. Having separated the essential from the accidental, the pure from the impure, the aspirant now consciously combines the purified principles in a sacred marriage within consciousness. This corresponds to the hieros gamos of alchemical symbolism, the union of opposites that generates new life. Psychologically, conjunction represents the initial integration of conscious and unconscious, ego and shadow, masculine and feminine principles. Jung recognized this stage as the emergence of the psychic androgyne, a state of consciousness that has integrated both masculine and feminine capacities, both solar clarity and lunar receptivity, both active willing and passive allowing. This integration creates a sense of internal completeness that reduces the compulsive need to seek completion through external relationships. The practitioner discovers an inner wholeness that makes them less dependent on social validation, romantic projection, or collective belonging. Yet this very completeness creates its own form of isolation. The practitioner no longer needs others in the way that unintegrated people need each other, to carry projections, to complete missing pieces, to validate ego identifications. Relationships become possible from a place of fullness rather than emptiness. But this new relational capacity has nowhere to express itself because most people remain in the old paradigm of neediness and projection. Fermentation introduces a new principle from a higher source. The conjunction has created a union, but this union remains earthly and personal. Fermentation represents the introduction of spiritual influence into the purified psychic substance, the descent of what alchemists called the philosophical wine or the secret fire. Psychologically, this corresponds to the activation of what Jung termed the self, the archetypal image of wholeness that transcends personal consciousness. The fermentation stage often manifests as a profound spiritual opening, moments of genuine transcendence where the aspirant experiences consciousness beyond the personal ego-self axis. These experiences may take the form of mystical union, cosmic consciousness, encounters with transpersonal intelligences, or simply periods of profound peace and clarity that seem to come from beyond the personal psyche. The aspirant realizes that transformation is not merely a personal project, but participation in a larger cosmic process. This recognition brings both exaltation and new suffering. The exaltation comes from touching something vast and eternal that gives meaning to the entire difficult journey. The suffering arises from the widening gap between the aspirant's expanding consciousness and the limited awareness of the surrounding world. Having touched transcendence, the practitioner finds ordinary consciousness increasingly intolerable, yet they must continue to function in a world organized around ordinary consciousness. Distillation follows fermentation as the process of purifying the fermented substance, removing all remaining impurities through repeated cycles of evaporation and condensation. Psychologically, this represents the refinement of spiritual insight through discipline and practice. The aspirant must now embody in daily life and action the transcendent realizations glimpsed during fermentation. This demands the development of what might be called spiritual sobriety, the capacity to maintain contact with transcendent awareness while engaging fully with material reality. Distillation requires the practitioner to become vertical in a horizontal world, to maintain awareness of higher dimensions while navigating ordinary life. This creates a kind of double consciousness that is extremely demanding to sustain. The aspirant must remember their true nature while performing social roles, must maintain inner silence while speaking, must honor the sacred while handling the mundane. This constant dual awareness intensifies the sense of being a stranger in a strange land, a visitor who speaks the language but comes from elsewhere. The distillation phase also involves what Jung called the circumambulation of the self, the spiraling approach to the center through repeated cycles of insight, integration, regression, and renewed insight. Each cycle reveals and removes another layer of subtle ego identification, another attachment to being someone special, another claim to spiritual achievement. True distillation produces humility not as a virtue to be cultivated, but as a natural result of recognizing how much unconsciousness remains despite all progress. Coagulation represents the final stage, the fixing of the volatile, the crystallization of the philosopher's stone, the incarnation of the self in stable form within consciousness. This corresponds to what Jung called the realization of the self, not merely an experience of wholeness, but a permanent restructuring of consciousness around a transpersonal center. The practitioner becomes what the Hermetic tradition calls an adept, one who has achieved a stable, integrated state of consciousness that unifies all previous stages. Coagulation manifests as the capacity to be fully present in material reality, while simultaneously aware of spiritual dimensions. The adept moves through the world with complete engagement, yet without attachment, responds to circumstances with appropriate action, yet without identification, forms relationships based on recognition rather than need. This is the promise of Hermetic transformation, not escape from the human condition, but its complete fulfillment, not transcendence of matter, but its spiritualization. Yet here emerges the final and perhaps most profound loneliness of the path. The coagulated consciousness has become so fundamentally different from ordinary consciousness that genuine meeting becomes rare. The adept can function perfectly in social contexts, can speak all the appropriate words, and perform all the expected behaviors, yet an invisible barrier remains. Others sense something different about the adept, something that attracts and disturbs in equal measure. True companionship becomes possible only with others who have completed similar work, and such individuals are vanishingly rare. Within the overall arc of Hermetic transformation lies a particularly intense crisis point that determines whether the aspirant will complete the work or abandon it. This crisis, traditionally associated with the nigredo or blackening phase of alchemy, corresponds to what mystical traditions call the dark night of the soul, a period of profound despair, meaninglessness, and existential agony that tests the aspirant's commitment to the path beyond all reasonable limits. The dark night typically occurs after the practitioner has made significant progress. Initial enthusiasm has been sustained through years of practice. Meaningful insights have accumulated. Psychological integration has produced tangible improvements in life functioning. The aspirant feels they are genuinely progressing on the path, and precisely at this moment of confidence, everything collapses. Practices that once produced insight yield only emptiness. The sense of divine presence withdraws completely. All meaning drains from spiritual work, leaving only mechanical effort without reward or purpose. Jung recognized this crisis as necessary rather than pathological. He observed that the ego, having initially cooperated with the individuation process, eventually reaches a point where further transformation threatens its very existence. The ego cannot voluntarily accept its own relativization, the recognition that it is not the center of personality, but merely one complex among many, serving a larger self. This recognition feels like annihilation to the ego, and it fights desperately against its own dissolution. The dark night manifests the ego's death struggle. All the psychological defenses that the aspirant thought had been overcome reassert themselves with redoubled force. Patterns of addiction, depression, anxiety, and dissociation return in full force. The practitioner finds themselves acting out behaviors they believed they had transcended years ago. This regression is profoundly demoralizing because it seems to prove that all previous progress was illusory, that transformation is impossible, that the spiritual path itself is a delusion. What distinguishes this crisis from ordinary psychological pathology is its teleological function. Clinical depression has no inherent purpose. It is suffering without meaning, a dysregulation of neurotransmitters and cognitive patterns that requires medical intervention. The dark night, by contrast, has a specific purpose within the economy of transformation. It forces the complete surrender of ego control and the acceptance of a transpersonal center of identity. This suffering has direction and intelligence. It relentlessly strips away everything false until only the essential remains. The Hermetic tradition emphasizes that this stage cannot be abbreviated or avoided. Attempts to bypass the dark night through spiritual bypassing, using spiritual concepts and practices to avoid psychological pain, only delay the crisis and intensify it when it finally arrives. The aspirant must descend fully into the underworld, must experience complete psychological death, must confront the absolute possibility that there is no meaning, no purpose, no transcendence, no self, only an elaborate self-deception constructed to avoid facing the void. This confrontation with the void represents the most profound isolation in the entire Hermetic journey. The aspirant cannot be accompanied into this darkness. No teacher, no teaching, no practice provides relief. Previous spiritual experiences seem like distant fantasies, perhaps hallucinations produced by an unstable psyche seeking comfort in illusion. The companionship of others on the path becomes impossible, because each person's dark night is utterly individual, shaped by their specific psychological structure, their particular attachments, their unique forms of resistance to transformation. The most excruciating aspect of this crisis is its attack on meaning itself. The aspirant can endure tremendous suffering if it serves a purpose, if progress is being made, if light lies ahead. But the dark night removes all such consolations. It presents as meaningless suffering without purpose or end, the perfect existential nightmare for someone who has organized their entire life around the pursuit of meaning and transformation. The aspirant must find the capacity to continue the work even when it appears utterly pointless, to maintain practice even when practice produces only emptiness, to remain on the path even when the path seems to lead nowhere. Friends and family become helpless witnesses to this crisis. They see someone they care about suffering intensely, yet nothing they offer provides relief. Their attempts to help, suggestions to take medication, to get more sleep, to exercise, to think more positively, reveal a complete incomprehension of what is occurring. The aspirant realizes that their ordeal cannot be explained to those who have not undergone similar trials. Language fails, communication becomes impossible, the isolation becomes total. Yet within this absolute darkness, something extraordinary occurs. At the moment of complete surrender, when the ego finally exhausts itself in futile struggle and admits defeat, a new center of consciousness emerges. Jung called this the birth of the self. But birth seems too gentle a word for what actually occurs. It is more like a cosmic earthquake that restructures the entire psychic landscape, a supernova that destroys the old personality structure while simultaneously creating new forms from the ruins. The aspirant discovers that what they feared as annihilation was actually liberation. The death of the ego as center does not produce psychic dissolution, but rather psychic reorganization around a transpersonal axis. Consciousness continues, but from a different locus, no longer identified with the personal self, but rather witnessing the personal self from a perspective that transcends it. This shift cannot be grasped intellectually. It must be lived through with every fiber of one's being. What differentiates this crisis from mental illness is the emergence from it transformed rather than damaged. Clinical depression leaves scars, trauma, increased vulnerability to future episodes. The dark night, when successfully navigated, produces permanent expansion of consciousness, increased psychological resilience, and access to dimensions of experience unavailable before the crisis. The suffering proves to have been initiatory, a rite of passage that restructures consciousness itself. The Hermetic tradition teaches that this crisis is actually an encounter with the guardian of the threshold, the terrifying face that spiritual development presents before allowing entry to deeper mysteries. The guardian appears as everything the aspirant most fears: meaninglessness, madness, isolation, annihilation. Only those willing to face this terror, to walk directly into what appears to be certain destruction, prove themselves worthy to continue. The guardian's function is not to prevent progress, but to ensure that only those with sufficient commitment and capacity proceed to stages where incomplete preparation could prove catastrophic. The aspirant who survives the dark night emerges transformed in ways that justify the Hermetic tradition's extravagant promises. This transformation, symbolized as the philosopher's stone or the self-realized consciousness, represents not the acquisition of something new, but the revelation of what was always present beneath layers of conditioning, identification, and unconsciousness. The adept has not become superhuman, but has become authentically human, has actualized capacities latent within human nature, but rarely developed due to the demands and distractions of ordinary life. The primary characteristic of the integrated consciousness is what might be called transparent awareness, the capacity to observe all psychological content without identification or attachment while simultaneously remaining fully engaged with life. The adept experiences thoughts, emotions, desires, and sensations with full intensity, but recognizes them as phenomena arising within consciousness rather than as constitutive of identity. This creates a spaciousness within experience that allows appropriate response rather than automatic reaction. This transparent awareness extends to social interaction in profound ways. The adept perceives the unconscious motivations, projections, and archetypal patterns operating in others without judgment or the need to intervene. This perception creates what appears to others as uncanny insight or even psychic ability. The adept seems to see through social masks and read hidden intentions. In reality, the adept simply observes obvious patterns that most people defend against noticing, because such noticing would destabilize their ego identifications. The ethical implications of this transformation deserve careful consideration. The adept operates from what the Hermetic tradition calls alignment with the true will, action that emerges spontaneously from integrated consciousness rather than from ego desire or social conditioning. This creates behavior that may appear unconventional or even incomprehensible to others, yet proves consistently beneficial when examined in larger context. The adept trusts inner guidance over external authority, direct perception over received opinion, authentic response over prescribed behavior. Yet this ethical autonomy carries profound responsibility. The adept can no longer claim ignorance or unconsciousness as excuse for harmful action. Having achieved the capacity for conscious choice, uncontaminated by compulsion or conditioning, the adept becomes fully accountable for all choices and their consequences. This responsibility extends beyond personal action to include the effects of the adept's presence and influence on others. The integrated consciousness radiates a subtle influence that affects all those it encounters, an influence that can either support or hinder others' development depending on the adept's integrity. The practical application of Hermetic achievement in modern life presents unique challenges. Contemporary society offers few models or roles for the adept consciousness. Traditional societies recognized and honored the sage, the mystic, the spiritual master, creating social niches where transformed individuals could serve their communities while maintaining their distinct consciousness. Modern culture, organized around production, consumption, and entertainment, has no place for those who have transcended these motivations. The adept must create their own life structure, often appearing from the outside, to lead an ordinary existence while operating from an extraordinary inner state. This brings us to the final and perhaps most important aspect of Hermetic transformation, its inherent loneliness. The adept has not transcended the need for human connection, but has transcended the forms of connection available to most people. Relationships based on ego validation, mutual projection, shared unconsciousness, or conventional role-playing no longer satisfy. The adept seeks rare encounters with others who have achieved similar integration, moments of genuine meeting between transparent awarenesses that recognize each other across the gulf of ordinary consciousness. The Hermetic teaching accepts this loneliness as intrinsic to the path rather than as a problem to be solved. The very factors that create isolation, depth of self-knowledge, transparency of awareness, ethical autonomy, commitment to truth, are precisely the achievements that justify the entire endeavor. The adept would not trade these qualities for comfortable belonging within collective unconsciousness. The loneliness becomes a mark of accomplishment, a confirmation of successful transformation, a seal of genuine attainment. The Hermetic school, in its insistence on rigorous analysis, historical accuracy, and philosophical depth, serves as a guardian of authentic Hermetic transmission against the degradation of these teachings into feel-good platitudes or marketable self-help formulas. The discipline required to engage seriously with Hermetic philosophy, the study of original texts, the practice of sustained introspection, the commitment to psychological honesty, itself functions as a filter that separates genuine aspirants from spiritual tourists seeking easy answers or comfortable beliefs. This filtering function explains why the Hermetic tradition has always been esoteric, not hidden by conspiracy, but self-concealing by its very nature. The teachings reveal themselves only to those who have developed the capacity to understand them through direct inner work. Others may read the same texts, hear the same lectures, perform the same practices, yet comprehend only the surface meanings because they lack the experiential reference points that would allow deeper penetration. The Hermetic path creates its own elite, not of social privilege or institutional authority, but of achieved consciousness and verified insight. The promise of the Hermetic path, then, is not a return to comfortable social belonging, but the discovery of something far more valuable: authentic selfhood, transparent awareness, ethical autonomy, and the capacity to recognize and meet others who have achieved similar transformation. The loneliness of the path transforms from burden to privilege, from suffering to be endured into solitude to be cherished. The adept discovers that true companionship requires two integrated consciousnesses meeting in recognition, and that such meetings, though rare, provide deeper satisfaction than a lifetime of conventional relationships based on mutual unconsciousness. The gold that the Hermetic aspirant seeks cannot be purchased, inherited, or bestowed by authority. It must be produced through sustained application of heat and pressure to the prima materia of one's own psychological substance. This production occurs in the sealed vessel of individual consciousness, in solitude, through processes that cannot be delegated or shared. The aspirant who accepts this fundamental aloneness, who embraces the separation from others as necessary rather than tragic, takes the first genuine step on the path that leads to the philosopher's stone, that state of consciousness which transforms everything it touches into gold. The crucible demands not company, but commitment. The fire of transformation burns brightest in solitude, where nothing remains but the work itself and the will that sustains it. The gold you seek is not in the vessel, but in the hand that refuses to remove it from the flame.